The screams of a 2-month-old baby tore through the silence of the private jet. For 3 hours, the crying had not stopped. Not the flight attendants could calm him. Not the expensive formula bottles prepared by the crew. Not even the powerful man holding him in his arms. And that man was not just anyone. David Miller was a mafia boss whose name was whispered in the shadows of the city with more fear than a death sentence. A man who had dismantled rival crime families without the slightest tremor. But tonight, his hands were shaking. David looked down at the tiny, red-faced baby struggling in his arms. The child's desperate cries filled the cabin, echoing against the polished walls of the luxury jet. His jaw tightened with exhaustion. 8 weeks earlier, his wife Maria had died during childbirth. Since that night, the baby refused to drink milk from a bottle. Doctors had tried everything. Expensive specialists had been flown in from different cities. Nothing worked. And David Miller, the man who could buy almost anything in the world, could not buy a single moment of peace for his son. "Sir," his lead guard whispered, keeping his eyes strictly on the floor. "The pilot says we can land early. We can find a doctor, No." David's voice was a low, dangerous growl that vibrated with exhaustion. "He's not sick. He's grieving. And I can't fix it." David looked at the empty seat beside him, the seat where his wife should have been. She had died 8 weeks ago, leaving him with a kingdom of blood and a son who refused to accept a plastic bottle as a substitute for a mother's warmth. 3 rows back, tucked into the shadows of the last row of first class, Sarah Vance felt her heart fracture. She wasn't supposed to be on this flight. It was a last-minute ticket to escape the ghost of her own life. 6 months ago, she had walked out of a hospital with empty arms and a shattered soul after her own daughter had passed away in the middle of a Tuesday night. But her body hadn't forgotten. As the baby's cries reached a frantic, gasping pitch, Sarah felt the familiar, painful ache in her chest, the biological response of a mother who still had milk but no mouth to feed. She watched the man in the front row. He looked like an ancient god carved from stone. Sharp jawline, eyes as dark as midnight, and an aura of violence so thick it made the flight attendants stumble when they walked past him. He was a man who clearly owned the world, yet he couldn't buy his son a single moment of peace. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt. The click sounded like a gunshot in the tense cabin. "Miss, please stay seated," a stewardess hissed, her face pale. Sarah didn't listen. She walked down the aisle, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she approached, 2 shadows, huge men with bulges under their jackets, stepped into her path. "That's enough," one growled. "Move," Sarah said, her voice steady with a nurse's authority. "He's not just hungry. He's starving for something familiar. You're going to let him cry until his lungs give out, or you're going to let me help." David's head snapped up. His gaze hit her like a physical weight, predatory, calculating, and dangerously curious. He looked at the woman standing before him. A stranger with eyes full of a sorrow that mirrored his own. "You think you can do what my money couldn't?" David asked, his voice rough like gravel wrapped in velvet. Sarah looked at the red-faced infant and then back at the boss. "Money can buy a kingdom, Mr. Miller. But it can't buy this." The silence in the airplane bathroom was thick, broken only by the soft sounds of the baby finally eating. Sarah sat on the closed lid of the toilet, holding little Leo against her heart. For the first time in months, the heavy ache in her chest began to fade. As the baby drank, his tiny hand curled around her thumb. He wasn't her daughter, but in this quiet moment, the grief that had followed her since the hospital didn't feel quite so heavy. Outside the door, the world was waiting. When Sarah finally stepped back into the cabin, the change was immediate. David stood there like a statue. The moment he saw his son sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms, his hard face softened just for a second. He took the child from her with a gentleness that didn't match his scary reputation. His fingers brushed hers, and Sarah felt a strange spark, a mix of fear and something she couldn't name. "He's asleep," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "He should be fine now. I'll just go back to my seat." But as the jet wheels hit the ground and the engines roared to a stop, the exit door didn't just open for a normal walk to the terminal. Instead, a line of black SUVs drove right up to the plane on the dark runway. David didn't let her move. He stood tall, his shadow falling over her. "You don't understand what you've done, Sarah," he said. His voice was no longer a growl, it was a promise. "In my world, some things are deeper than blood. My grandfather taught me the old laws. By feeding my son, you have become milk-kin. You are no longer a stranger." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "I was just being a nurse, David. I was helping a hungry baby. To the rest of the world, you are now the most important woman in my life," David replied as the guards opened the car doors. "You gave him the one thing I couldn't provide. That makes you sacred to my family, but it also makes you a target for my enemies." Sarah tried to step toward the terminal, but the large guards moved like a wall of stone, blocking her path. She looked at the circle of black cars and the men with cold eyes watching her every move. The freedom she had been looking for when she bought her plane ticket was gone. David leaned in close, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You saved my son, Sarah. But now, the rest of the world is your enemy because of it. You aren't going home tonight. You're coming with me." Before she could scream or argue, she was being led toward the SUVs. She looked back at the plane, realizing that the simple act of kindness she offered in the sky had just trapped her in a world of fire and blood on the ground. The black SUV drove through massive iron gates that looked like they belonged to a castle. Sarah watched out the window as the car moved up a long path lined with tall trees. When they finally stopped, a house made of white stone stood before her. It was beautiful, but the high walls and the men carrying weapons on the lawn made it feel like a very expensive cage. David led her inside, his hand resting lightly on her back. He didn't force her, but she knew she couldn't run. Every hallway they passed was filled with expensive paintings and golden lights. Finally, they stopped at a heavy wooden door. When David opened it, Sarah gasped. The room was perfect. It was filled with soft blankets, fresh flowers, and a window that looked out over a quiet garden. But then she saw the smaller door in the corner. She walked over and pushed it open, finding herself in a nursery that looked exactly like her new room. "I wanted you to be close to him," David said from the doorway. He had shed his suit jacket, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up. Without the armor of his expensive clothes, he looked less like a boss and more like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. Sarah spent the next few hours focused on Leo. She bathed him and rocked him, feeling the familiar weight of a baby against her shoulder. David stayed in the room, sitting in a large chair in the corner. He didn't say much, but he watched her every move. At first, Sarah thought he was judging her, but then she saw his eyes. They weren't cold or scary anymore. They were filled with a deep, crushing sadness that he walked over to a small table and picked up a framed photo of a beautiful woman with a bright smile. Her name was Maria, he whispered. She was the heart of this house. Now, the halls just feel empty. Sarah looked at the photo, then back at him. She thought about her own daughter, Emma, and the nursery at home that stayed dark and quiet. "I know that feeling," she said softly. "The silence is the loudest part." In that moment, the scary Mafia boss disappeared. David sat on the edge of the rocking chair, his head in his hands. He was just a father who had lost his partner and didn't know how to keep his world from falling apart. Sarah reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture of comfort from one broken soul to another. They were strangers from different worlds, but their shared pain for the ones they had lost created a bond that was stronger than the thick stone walls around them. The peace in the mansion didn't last long. Over the next few days, the house felt like a small island of calm in a very dangerous sea. Sarah stayed busy with Leo, watching the color return to his cheeks. Every time she looked up from the crib, David was there. He started helping with small things, like holding the blanket or testing the temperature of the water. They talked in low voices about simple things, but the air between them was always tight, like a string pulled too far. On the fourth evening, the sun was setting, painting the garden in shades of deep orange and purple. David invited Sarah to sit on the back porch while Leo slept in a portable bassinet between them. For a moment, with the smell of blooming roses and the sound of crickets, Sarah almost forgot she was in a fortress. "You look different here," Sarah said, watching David look out over the lawn. "Not like the man on the plane." David leaned back, but his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the tree line. "The man on the plane has to keep everyone afraid so he can keep his family safe. But here..." He stopped and looked at her. "Here, I just want to be the man who deserves to have you in his house." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. She was about to answer when she noticed something strange. A tiny, bright red dot appeared on the front of her white sweater. It was dancing right over her heart. Before she could even process what it was, David's face transformed. The softness vanished, replaced by a look of pure, lethal fury. "Get down," he roared.
Get down.
He didn't wait for her to move. David lunged across the space, his large body slamming into hers. He tackled her off the chair and onto the hard stone floor, using his own back to shield both her and Leo. A loud crack echoed through the air, and a nearby flower pot shattered into 1,000 pieces. Pain flared in David's shoulder as a second shot buzzed past, but he didn't make a sound. He dragged Sarah and the bassinet toward the heavy glass doors, his hand already pulling a weapon from his waistband. Alarms began to scream throughout the estate, and Sarah could hear the heavy boots of guards running toward them. "Is it him?" Sarah gasped, her lungs feeling tight with fear. "Is it the rival you told me about?" David pushed her toward the hallway where Mark and the other guards were waiting. His shirt was stained red where the bullet had grazed him, but he didn't even flinch. "Vince has officially crossed the line," David growled, his eyes turning as dark as a midnight storm. "He didn't just attack a boss. He attacked the woman who saved my son. Now, I'm going to end this war once and for all." The world outside the nursery turned into a storm of noise and flashing lights. David didn't waste a second. With one hand gripping his weapon and the other steering Sarah toward the center of the house, he moved with a speed that took her breath away. They reached a large library where David pulled a hidden lever behind a row of old books. A section of the wall slid open, revealing a heavy steel elevator. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she clutched Leo to her chest. "To the only place I know they can't reach you," David replied. The elevator dropped deep into the earth. When the doors opened, Sarah didn't find a cold basement. Instead, she stepped into a high-tech apartment filled with soft lights, a kitchen, and a wall of television screens. This was the Miller family's secret bunker. David walked over to the screens. They showed every angle of the mansion above. Sarah could see the shadows of men moving through the trees and the bright flashes of gunfire. It looked like a scene from a movie, but the shaking of the floor reminded her it was very real. "I have to go back up," David said. He turned to Sarah, and for a moment, the coldness of the battle disappeared. He reached out and touched her hair. The thick steel doors are locked from the inside. Not even a bomb can get through. Stay here. Stay quiet. I'm coming back for you. Before she could beg him to stay, the elevator doors closed. Sarah was alone with the baby in the absolute silence of the underground. To calm her racing heart, she began to walk around the room. On a small desk, she found an old leather book. It was a diary belonging to Maria, David's late wife. As the muffled sounds of explosions echoed from far above, Sarah began to read. She discovered a side of David no one else saw. Maria wrote about how David hated the violence of his life and how they had planned to run away together before Leo was born. He wasn't a man who loved power, he was a man trapped by his own name. Sarah looked at the monitors and saw David standing near the front gates, leading his men with a look of desperate bravery. She realized then that he wasn't just fighting for his territory anymore. He was fighting for the chance to be the man Maria had described in the diary, the man Sarah was starting to love. But as she watched, a group of dark figures appeared on a screen she hadn't noticed before. They were already inside the house, moving toward the elevator. Sarah woke up with a pounding headache in a room that felt like an old, cold museum. Her arms were empty, and for a second, panic flared in her chest until she saw Leo. He was sleeping in a beautiful wooden crib nearby. A man sat at a desk across the room, watching her. It was Vince. David is already on his way, Vince said, tapping a ring against the table. I sent him a video of you sleeping. He offered me his entire empire, every building, every ship, every cent, just to let you walk away. He's willing to become a nobody for a nurse he met a week ago. Sarah sat up, her head spinning. He loves his son, Vince. He isn't the monster you are. Vince laughed, but his eyes stayed mean. He's weak now. And in our world, weakness gets you killed. He thinks this is a trade, but I'm going to make him watch me take everything he loves before I end him. As the sun began to set, Vince dragged Sarah and Leo to a large balcony. Below, in the middle of a wide, empty courtyard, stood David. He was alone. No guards, no guns in his hands, just a man standing in the wind. I'm here, Vince. David shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The papers are signed. The Miller Empire is yours. Now give them to me. Vince stepped out onto the balcony, holding a gun near Sarah's head. You were always too soft, David. Did you really think I'd let a Miller live to hunt me down later? Sarah looked down at David. He looked tired and beaten, but when his eyes met hers, she saw a spark of the great wolf. He wasn't giving up, he was waiting. Sarah realized she had to give him a chance. She remembered her training as a nurse, how to stay calm in a crisis. Vince, wait. Sarah cried out, pretending to stumble. The baby, he isn't breathing right. Look. As Vince instinctively looked down at Leo in the bassinet, distracted for just 1 second, Sarah slammed her elbow into Vince's ribs as hard as she could. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Vince stumbled back, his shot going wild into the air. At that exact moment, the courtyard erupted. David didn't just stand there, he pulled a hidden weapon from his boot and moved like a shadow. Gunfire filled the air as David's men, who had been hiding in the trees, charged the estate. David was already running toward the stairs, his eyes locked on the balcony. He wasn't coming for an empire anymore. He was coming for his family. The balcony became a blur of action. David burst through the doors, his eyes burning with a fire Sarah had never seen. Vince tried to raise his weapon, but David was faster. With a powerful strike, he knocked the gun from Vince's hand and pinned him against the stone railing. For a moment, David looked like the monster the world feared, his fist raised to deliver a final blow. "David, stop." Sarah's voice rose above the shouting and the sirens. She was holding Leo tightly, her body shaking. "If you kill him like this, you're just like him. Don't let this life take the man Maria loved." David froze. He looked at Vince, then at Sarah and his son. The tension in his shoulders slowly faded. He let out a long breath and lowered his hand. "You're right," he whispered. He turned to his guards, who had finally reached the balcony. "Take him away. Hand him over to the police. I'm done with the blood." A few days later, a group of powerful men in dark suits gathered at a secret location in the city. They were the Council of Families, the rulers of the underground. David walked into the room, but he wasn't wearing his usual crisp suit. He looked like a normal man ready for a long journey. "You can't just leave, Miller," one of the older men growled. "The Miller name carries weight. You have territories to run." David stood tall and placed a thick envelope on the table. "I'm invoking the milk law," he said firmly. Every man in the room went silent. They knew the old traditions. Sarah Vance saved the Miller heir. "She is sacred to my house. By the laws of our ancestors, I am choosing to protect my family over my power. I am abdicating my throne." The men looked at each other, whispering. The milk law was ancient and could not be broken. By claiming Sarah as sacred, David had found the only way out of the Mafia that didn't end in a grave. They had no choice but to let him go. Sarah waited for him in the car outside. When David walked out of the building, he looked lighter, as if a mountain had been lifted off his back. He got into the driver's seat and looked at Sarah and Leo. "It's done," David said, a real smile finally touching his lips. "The empire is gone. We have nothing left but a ranch in the mountains and each other." "That's more than enough for me," Sarah replied, reaching over to take his hand. The life of a Mafia boss was over. The life of a father and a husband was finally beginning. The air in Montana was crisp and smelled of pine needles instead of city smoke. Sarah stood on the wide wooden porch of their new ranch house, watching the sun dip behind the snow-capped mountains. In the distance, she could see David. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit or looking over his shoulder for enemies. Instead, he was wearing worn-out jeans and a flannel shirt, working to fix a wooden fence. Leo was no longer the tiny, fragile baby from the airplane. He was nearly a year old now, crawling happily across a soft blanket on the porch, chasing a golden retriever puppy. He was healthy, strong, and full of laughter. David finished his work and walked toward the house. As he climbed the porch steps, he gathered Leo into his arms and kissed Sarah's forehead. "The quiet still feels strange sometimes," he admitted, looking out at their peaceful land. "But I wouldn't trade it for all the gold in the world." "No more phone calls from the city?" Sarah asked. "None," David smiled. "The council kept their word. Since I walked away for the milk kin, I'm a ghost to them. We're finally free." Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, white plastic stick. She had been waiting for the right moment all day. She handed it to him, her heart thumping with excitement. David looked down at the two bright pink lines, and his eyes went wide. Are we?" he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "Leo is going to be a big brother," Sarah whispered. David let out a shout of pure joy that echoed through the valley. He pulled Sarah into a tight hug, holding his family close. 6 months ago, Sarah had boarded a plane with a broken heart, thinking she would never be a mother again. She had offered a gift to a crying baby because she couldn't stand his pain, never knowing that a simple act of kindness would lead her to a new life. She had saved a mafia boss's son, and in return, the boss had saved her right back. They had left behind a kingdom of blood to build a home of love. As the stars began to twinkle over the big Montana sky, Sarah looked at her husband and her son. The unthinkable act on a plane had turned into the most beautiful reality she could have ever imagined. The Miller family was finally whole.